Thank you very much. It's good to be here. It's been about 8 or 10 years since I was at Indiana last, so it's nice to see that the building's still standing and everything's in good order. So the topic tonight is the campaign and what's been happening in it, and a little bit of the dynamics, a little bit of composition. What we do at Pollster is take all of the data, all the publicly available polls, and analyze them and display them so that you can see the polling within the context of all the polls. It's a real habit of the media to sponsor a poll, produce it, and then report the results as if it existed totally on its own without any other context around it. And when that's done particularly egregiously, it leaves you to think that a poll has told you one thing when in fact in context it's told you nearly the opposite. An example of that was in the spring of 2006. President Bush's approval ratings had been falling pretty steadily for a while. But Newsweek magazine did one survey in February and another survey in late May, and discovered that Bush's approval had dropped dramatically over that time. And they blamed it all on a speech that he had done earlier in the week when he had been talking about an immigration compromise. Only one little problem with that, because Newsweek had done these two polls this far apart. They neglected the fact that all of the other polling showed that approval had indeed come down, but it did come back up. And if anything, the reaction to the speech on immigration was a positive reaction, some of the first good news the Bush administration had had in a while. And because they just sort of ignored the fact that there were dozens and dozens of polls in between and only focused on the two that they had sponsored, they ended up with a conclusion that was exactly opposite of the truth. And I like to pick on them because that's just one of the more egregious examples. And a few media sources now are taking a little bit more attention to that and understanding that maybe it doesn't kill them if they mention a competitor's polling as well. But the one thing we're trying to do at Pollster is to put all of the polling out there so that if the first motto is put the data in perspective, in context, the second motto would be no cherry picking. Because everybody out there in the political world finds a poll that looks better for their guy than for the other guy and then interprets it as if that was the whole story. And so again, if you cherry pick the polls, you can easily find something that you like or something that is devastating to the other guy. If we just have this simple rule, no cherry picking, things become a little bit, if only a little bit, clearer. And so tonight I'll mostly be talking about that, trying to put these things in context. So here's an example of the kind of analysis we do, and the one we'll be talking about tonight. This is every national poll taken in the country on the presidential campaign since January 1st of 2008. We've been collecting these data since 2006, when people first started frequently asking about the presidential race. Every little circle is a poll, somewhere between 800 and 1,200 people typically. And what you see, first of all, is how much scatter there is vertically here, so that polls taken close to the same point in time show a range of values. And that's the thing that drives normal people and journalists crazy, because they ask, how can it be that we see one poll showing McCain ahead by 3 points and another poll showing Obama ahead by 4, and they were both done at the same time and they just don't agree with each other? Isn't this a demonstration of the bankruptcy of the polling industry? Not quite, but close. It partly derives from a failure to appreciate what random sampling means, which is the basis for all polling. If we draw a random sample of the population, then we know, through statistical theory, that that sample on average will give a result, like support for a candidate, equal to what it is in the population, but only on average. The margin of error around that, typically about plus or minus 3 points for a typical poll in here, is going to vary. is going to vary randomly over the different polls that are conducted at one point in time. In addition to sampling error like that, there's also randomness that comes from not everyone you try to interview is willing to be interviewed to respond. So next time a pollster calls, please answer their questions. Don't be a non-respondent. Second thing is the order in which you ask questions, the way you word the questions. There are a variety of things that can lead to more variability than you would get just from the random sampling. Okay? And that variability adds to the sampling error. That kind of non-sampling error, the whole world is divided into sampling error and non-sampling error, increases the variability of the polls by as much as about 50%. So if a normal poll has about a plus or minus 3 percentage point margin of error, when you include the non-sampling sources of error, it goes up by about 50%. So say about plus or minus 4.5% would be a more reasonable estimate of the total variability in a poll. So if that's true, plus or minus 4.5%, it means that when we see a result for a bunch of polls, it's not at all surprising if the spread goes from something minus 4.5 to something plus 4.5. That's about a 9-point range, which in a close election is plenty to produce seemingly conflicting polls, even though the poor polls are trying their best to conform to the theory of random sampling. There's a sense in which if the sample is really good, it ought to be exactly right. So you ought to have exactly the right number of Democrats and Republicans, exactly the right of whites and blacks, exactly the right of young, middle, and old age. But random sampling doesn't say that. What random sampling says, if you do this poll dozens of times, those things will be about right. But it doesn't say that any one poll will do exactly all those things. And so a favorite cottage industry is to find a poll that you don't like and then find some variable in it, whether it's age or sex or race or partisanship, that's not quite what you think it's supposed to be. Doesn't match the population under 30, say. And then attack the poll and try to discredit it on those grounds. That's really a fundamental misunderstanding of polling and surveys and random sampling. So, from that perspective, you'd expect this kind of vertical variation in the poll results, even if the polls are done exactly right, even if there aren't other complications as well. And you can certainly see plenty of variability. But the second part is, the theory says that the average of the polls ought to be, over a lot of polls, very close to that variable in the population. In this case, support for the candidates. And that's what the blue line here represents. This line is an estimate. It's not really an average, but we can call it that. I call it a trend. But for the geeks in the crowd, it's a local regression. But what it does is, if you look, it goes through the middle of the points. If we added up all the positive values above the line and all the negative values below the line, they'd all add up to 0. So the net above and below the line cancels one another out. That's a good definition of going through the middle of the data. But the theory says that it's also a pretty good estimate of where the opinion of the population is at each point in time. And as you can see, there's been a fair bit of variability over the course of this election year. With, the last thing. This vertical axis is the vote for Obama minus the vote for McCain. So it's just a measure of the margin, who's ahead and by how much. Values above 0 are Obama ahead, values below 0 are McCain ahead. There's no value judgment here on positive or negative, okay? So what you see is the two come into the year pretty much dead tied before either has really emerged in the primaries. As Obama has some success in the early primaries and not so much success in New Hampshire, but that's another story, Obama moves ahead by about 3 or 4 points, but then runs into trouble, namely Ohio and Texas, and then a long wait for Pennsylvania. In the meantime, John McCain comes close to wrapping up the race on Super Tuesday, essentially clinches it on February 19th. And so good news for McCain and struggles for Obama lead to a movement of about 6 points in McCain's direction, including a period with McCain running ahead of Obama. Obama loses Pennsylvania, but then goes through the rest of the primary season roughly equaling Clinton's performance. His advantage in delegates is insurmountable. Continues through here until about the 1st of June, when he finally wraps up the nomination. Clinton announces her support for him, and he gets a nice bounce during this period. And then for June and July, maintains about a 4.5, 5 point lead over McCain. Later in the summer, that starts to come down, and comes down in August in particular, before the Democratic Convention produces a nice bounce for Obama. But then the Republican Convention and the pick of Governor Palin produces a bigger Republican bounce. You can see there's actually quite a few polls that are even a little bit below where the blue line is. It's just not convinced that these are real, because there are also some up here, so it doesn't go quite as low as it might really. And this bottom part is about 2.5 weeks ago, either just before the financial crisis hit or just in the week that the financial crisis hit. And we see a turnaround, and Obama has had a rebound during this period to, I ran these data, these are data as of 4:05 this afternoon, okay? And so the margin right now at 5.6, as you can see, is the biggest lead Obama has had all year. So that's the ballpark. Oh, this lighter gray area is a 68% confidence interval, meaning in this case about 68% of the polls fall within that margin. And the darker gray is a 95% interval. You can, in a certain sense, think that the lead is statistically significant when it's outside the gray area. And in fact, you can see that right at the moment, it has just now ticked into strong Democratic lead, because with today's added data, the 0 point now falls just outside of the gray area. If you look back, you'll see that that's the first time this year that that's happened. Okay? And it only literally just happened between yesterday at 1:30 when I ran the data and today at 4:05 when I ran the data. So it's that recent. And it could change tomorrow. That's the other thing. These things can change. All right? By the way, if you have questions, feel free to stick your hand up and raise them. This is not good. Okay. So I want to start a little bit and talk about this dip, the Democratic Convention and the Republican Convention, what effects those had, and particularly the Republican Convention. Here we had the two conventions so jammed together that whereas in most election years there's a couple of weeks between conventions, this year there was no chance at all for the Democrats to coast on their convention before the Republicans and Governor Palin's introduction happened. Lots of people were very interested in those conventions. It's quite remarkable. The audience for Senator Obama's acceptance speech out in the football stadium was 38 million people. That's more than American Idol final show, more than the first night of the Olympics, and more than the Academy Awards. So that's a pretty good audience. Sarah Palin got 37.5 million, almost as much. And John McCain, who's not noted for the high oratory that he's capable of, got 39 million. Okay? Certainly a result that I think going into the conventions nobody would have expected McCain, on the basis of his speaking ability anyway, to not just match but to exceed Obama's audience. Now you might think that that audience is all driven by political supporters of the candidate that they're tuning into. On the night that Obama spoke, I was in Boston for a meeting, and my dinner ran late, and so the speech had started when I left to get a cab to get back to my hotel. And I come up on a line of cabs. There's maybe a dozen cabs in a row. Every single one of them has Obama's speech on the radio. So as you walk by, you hear it coming out of each window. You get to the front of the line of cabs. I got in it. The guy drove me out to my hotel, which was a good ways, and so we listened to the rest of the speech on the radio. Silence from the driver, rapt attention. We get to the hotel, and speech has just ended. I said, "So, what do you think?" And he said, "I don't think he can do all that stuff." Okay? So the point here is, don't buy that just because these audiences are huge, that either side is necessarily attracting only its core supporters to them. But it is quite striking that the audiences are as large as they are. Obama's speech was about 50% bigger than the audience for Kerry's speech, television audience. And so therefore, both Palin and McCain's speeches were also considerably bigger than at least Kerry got 4 years ago. But having said that, I want to take just a minute to look at the components of this dip. Not so much the bounce, but the post-Republican dip. And where we're going to look is whites, and particularly white women and white men. So the red line here is white women, the blue line is white men. You can see that over the late summer, white women were favoring McCain by a couple of points, but white men were favoring McCain by around 20 points. Okay? Big margins in both. The Palin pick is this vertical line, and you can just see how much white women responded to that pick. It's a move of around 12 points in McCain's favor. Quite large. The men, not nearly so much, only about 3 or 4 point move for them. Since whites make up about 78% of registered voters, and women make up about half of whites, then that means that much of the national shift in polling is driven because half of 78%, so roughly 39% of the electorate, moved by 12 points in those few days. And that brought the national polling along with it, and a little bit from the men. But then as we get to the financial crisis and the events both in a few days leading up to it and certainly the time afterwards, what we see is among women a reversal that's come back a little more than half of the gains that Palin had won from them. But more surprisingly, the men have shifted by about 10 points. So they've gone from a little more than 20 points pro-McCain to now, quote, only 10 points pro-McCain. Since it's been, good Lord, maybe since 1964, since a Democrat won the white vote. There may be one in there that I'm forgetting, but it's been a long time since a Democrat won the white vote nationally. Narrowing that to only a 10-point deficit or about 6-point deficit for Obama is actually quite good news. But as we saw in the national data, as this rebound has occurred, not all of it by any means, but a good chunk of it has been driven by the behavior of white voters, and in particular white men, but also women giving up more than half of those gains that McCain got from the convention and from Sarah Palin. Okay? I want to put this in a little bit of perspective, and it's a jumble, but we'll make sense of it. The blue line is what we've been looking at, the national trend in 2008. So this is what we've seen with the Democratic convention, the Republican convention, and now the rebound. But the red line is what happened in 2004, and the black line what happened in 2000. And the point of this is, look at the magnitude of shifts in support that occurred in those two previous elections. So in 2004, despite the fact that you have an incumbent president seeking re-election, and therefore lots of people should have made up their mind about President Bush by the 2004 campaign, in fact, there's a run-up here of about 8 points from Bush being ahead by whatever that is, 7.5 or so, up to Kerry ahead by about 1, so about an 8.5 point run there. Little bit of decline and then a long rise for Kerry of about 4 points, but then a Bush rise improvement of about 8 points, and then a little bit of movement to tighten the race at the end. So we've seen swings in 04 on the order of 8 points or so. In 2000, with no incumbent running, we saw gigantic moves. So this one from about 9 points for Bush to about, 4 points for Gore, a 13-point run. Nothing this year looks as close to that big a magnitude of run as you've seen before. And so an interesting side question is, why is it that this year is more stable than either of the two previous ones, and perhaps, especially to me anyway, surprising in light of the 04 election being the re-election of an incumbent president? Wouldn't really expect that. It's also a warning to you that it's true that we've only got, whatever it is, 36, 37 days left to go till the election. But judging the order of magnitude of these previous election shifts, don't be surprised if you don't see a run by either candidate that might be at least as big as anything we've seen already this year, and perhaps bordering on the scope of previous elections. So just keep that in perspective a little bit about how dynamic this year is compared to others. Yes?
The Bush-Gore ends up in favor of Bush, but Gore won.
Yep. This is the popular vote right here. And the polls moved in Gore's direction over the last weekend and Monday polling. But they didn't move far enough to capture the fact that he was actually the popular vote winner. In absolute value, it's only about a 2.5 point error. But in the qualitative side of, well, who won? It's a big error, right? Yeah. You might not sweat a 1.5 or even 3 points if you were on the right side of that. In 2004, it was a little bit better, about just over a 1 point difference, with a slight overestimate of Kerry's vote that came down. It's not really my topic, but since you brought it up, you might think about this issue of polling errors between here and here in 2000, and how, given that Bush had led in the polls by a small but steady couple of points for the last month or so of the campaign, how that set the expectation that he was likely to be the popular vote winner. The irony is that the Bush campaign had legal briefs prepared in case they were the popular vote winner but the electoral vote loser. And so they were all ready to go under that scenario, in part lulled by the fact that they were leading in the national polls. So when the surprising result happened that Gore was the popular vote winner, I think you can speculate interestingly about how that set an agenda and a framing of the interpretation of the outcome. If Gore had been leading in the polling going in, then the sense that, wait a second, he's the popular vote winner might have been different than the way it actually played out. And perhaps the Gore people should have tried to buy those legal briefs already ready from the Bush people, just globally replace Bush to Gore and submit the briefs. Obviously, the Bush campaign didn't have much use for those briefs after election night. Okay? Stop. One of the things that people regularly rip me apart on is, why are you looking at national data? Didn't Florida teach us anything that electoral votes matter, that this is an election in a federal system where the state-by-state results are the key thing? And that's a good question, but it posits or implies the notion that the states are somehow fundamentally different from the nation, or that the national polling is fundamentally different from what's going on in the states. And so I'm going to focus most of the rest of the talk on that topic. So here what you see, the light gray line is our old friend, the trend that we've been looking at all night, the national trend this year. But the black line is estimating the same Obama minus McCain vote, but using the 1,300 state polls that have been taken over this time. And so what we're doing is we're mashing together all of the state polls, and in effect, if the states move together, then that'll move the black line up and down as the states move up and down together. If the states move randomly, some up, some down, then that black line ought to be essentially flat, canceling out up and down. Okay? What do you see? The national polls don't exactly match the state estimate, but they both respond to the same national forces that are at work. And so when national forces are favorable towards Obama, it's not just the national polls that move, it's the agglomeration of dozens of state polls also moving in the same direction, reflecting the same national forces, whether they be news cycles or electoral success or economic issues, or for that matter, foreign policy, if anybody still cared about foreign policy. Just to point on that. At the 2006 elections, just 2 short years ago, 35% named Iraq the most important issue facing the country. 9% named the economy the most important problem facing the country. As of this past week, economy is over 45%, over 50% in some polls, Iraq under 10. So that's the radical change in the country's issue agenda in the last not quite 2 years. Bottom line is, the same forces that drive the national polls up and down seem to also drive the state polls up and down. It's not the case that people respond in states completely independently of what's going on in the nation. Jerry?
Could you comment on they seem to depart really sharply there toward the end?
Right here? Yes, actually, that's a great point. That wasn't there yesterday. And so what's happening back here, in these charts, I'm not putting up the dots for the individual polls because it just gets rather jumbled to see, though maybe that's a mistake on my part. Towards the end, all the time, you can get a set of new polls, but they only come from a handful of states. And where does most of the polling come from? Competitive states. There's really not a whole lot of polling being done in California or Utah or Massachusetts. And as a result, over a stretch of a week or so, we actually get a pretty good selection of polls from competitive and non-competitive states. But yesterday we got, or today actually, we got a load of new polls. I think there were 10 new state polls that came in overnight. And they come from competitive states overwhelmingly. And so they're pulling this down to an extent that is a little more than I think you'll see. If we wait a week, add in all of the new polling that's going to occur between here and a week from now, I'd make a small wager that this balances out as we get a little bit more polling. Bottom line is you should be a little leery of the end points no matter what, but in this state polling combination, you should be especially leery because any one day can have really imbalanced state results. Doesn't matter much back here because over the course of a couple of weeks, it's pretty well balanced. Yeah?
It's a methodological question. As you add those polls, is there a chance
Yeah,
that will
this line will
eventually
disappear.
the points stop?
It's entirely possible this will disappear, and in 2 weeks you wouldn't even know it was there. These lines are designed, and I'm not going to do a stats lecture, but they're designed to be resistant to unusual data. But at the end of the series, a few unusual points can exert more influence than you'd optimally like them to. I've got 2 hands. Yeah.
Yeah, the 2 curves follow each other fairly closely, but I noticed that the black line is almost always below the gray line.
Right.
Does that reflect some sort of structural advantage for the Republicans in the Electoral College?
I'm going to come back to that in the next slide, so let me partially defer the question. But I think it reflects both the tendency to interview in more competitive states and thus to produce more competition or apparent competition in this collection of things. So even when we have a poll from California, we're more likely to have 5 polls from Ohio in the same period that we have 1 poll from California. So I suspect that mashes it together. The real virtue of this black line is not, and it's not intended to be, an estimate of the vote that will occur. Instead, it's intended to be this measure of national forces that are driving the fortunes of candidates up and down across states. For example, I do not weight by state size or electoral vote, which is essentially the same thing. If I did that, I might or might not reproduce the national trend better, but that's exactly not my purpose. My purpose is to catch those movements which are common across states and therefore are more likely to be genuine national forces. You had a hand up earlier. No?
Well, I believe my question was answered, but
Oh, okay.
when you concluded on the anomaly, I guess.
Uh-huh.
at the end, So I guess you're saying there's some kind of statistical averaging that occurs?
You get, let me be honest, I don't know which states exactly were in the 10 that came in today, but they're very likely to be 10 battleground states, or let's say 7 battleground states and 3 not so battleground states. Those are almost surely going to be competitive, and the margin's likely to be narrower in those states.
Yeah, I understood that.
Okay, sorry. Then I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, actually, he
Okay.
asked my original question.
Okay.
My other question was about how this graph is constructed.
Oh, okay.
To me,
Okay.
that's not that important.
Well, let me pass on that, but I'll be happy to talk about it a little bit later on the details, but I'll just stop there. Yeah.
I saw a poll this morning, I saw an announcement of a poll this morning. It was a hotline poll, and it said, they gave the regular daily tracking, and then they said there was a battleground state poll in
Yes.
which Obama was up by 10, but it looked like they were
Right.
aggregate, was it not separated out by state?
Yeah,
I didn't see the
it's the all-state hotline battleground poll. I can only assume we're talking about an insurance company sponsoring it, but I just saw that in passing. I didn't have a chance to read it today, but apparently they're doing special polling in battleground states. However, they're relatively small samples. They're averaging about 600 per state. I caught that much.
But then they put them all together?
That's the part that I'm really not sure, and so I'm not sure where that 10-point figure is coming from. Yes?
I want to ask you about likely voter modeling.
Okay, let me postpone that.
Are you going to address that later?
I'd be happy to talk about it at length, but I'd rather come back to it at the end. So just don't let me forget it, because I do have stuff to say about it, but it's not part of the presentation. So let's move on. Let's look at the blue state. Well, don't look at that. This is my surprise. You're not supposed to look at it yet. So don't look at it. Pretend you hadn't seen that. Think about what you might imagine happening if you hadn't just seen my punchline. That we're divided into blue states and red states and a relative handful of competitive states. That narrative would suggest that the red states are just solid red. They don't respond to the campaign. The blue states are solid blue. They don't respond to the campaign. So if you're sitting in California and you're sitting next door in Utah, you're at totally different levels. The campaign is passing you by because, for goodness sake, there's not been a single ad aired in either of those states. I'd be surprised if there's been a candidate visit except to Barbara Streisand's house to raise a few $1 million. And you'd think that maybe that would just be really flat because there's no campaign going on. Likewise, in the competitive states, you'd expect these guys are being like us, and you guys are even getting ads this year, that we're being buffeted around by the campaign, and so you'd expect lots of movement. And that's exactly what you did not see here. Okay? So this is the same thing, except now dividing the states into whether they're strong Democratic, strong Republican, or some kind of battleground. The yellow line is both lean and toss-up states, and the purple line is pure toss-up states. Okay? But what you see is, in fact, again, all of these lines move together. But it's actually the safe states, the strong states, which show the biggest amplitude of movement. Okay? The biggest runs up, the biggest runs down, now big rebound. Democratic states a little lower than the Republican, but still some real movement. You look in here at the purple or the yellow lines, and there's movement, but it's smaller in amplitude than the others. So that produces a little mystery. How could we possibly explain that? And so I'm going to be upfront that what I'm about to explain is what I think is plausible, but I don't have direct evidence of. Here's the storyline, though. If you're in one of the blue or the red states, you get the national news, you get cable news, you get your local newspaper. What you don't get is campaign advertising. So when the nature of the world is favorable to one candidate or another, whether because of something they're doing in their campaign, again, events that they're winning, crises in the world, or happy times in the world, that's the message that you're getting. And that means that whoever is suffering in that period, when it's a bad, like right in here, this period was a bad time for Obama. What's going on? In those states, the bad time or the bad news from Obama is going largely unanswered by the Obama campaign because they're not advertising in that state. They're not doing events in the state. They're not spreading the word in the state. The result is the national forces, the national news, drives that state quite a ways. By the same token, when it's good news for Obama, whether it's here or here, McCain is not active in those states, and so he's not providing a countervailing message. What's paradoxical in these states is there's a ton of advertising, campaigning, ground game, candidate visits going on. And that means that even in a bad time for McCain here or a bad time for Obama here, the candidate who's being damaged by the national forces is always there on the 6 o'clock news, on Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune, which are the three highest rated campaign ad shows, always giving you their side of the story, even when the national forces are running against them. And that provides a countervailing force that's absent in the non-competitive states. So the net effect of that will be to dampen the oscillations or the amplitude of the shifts in these competitive states. And it all comes to this issue of whether voters are receiving one-sided flows of information or whether they're receiving competing flows of information. With competing flows, you get rough balance. Partisans of one side can always hear a story about why their guy's actually doing okay or is actually a good guy. If you don't have that flow of information, those same partisans are only hearing bad things about their guy, and they suffer from it. You can see that in the non-competitive states.
Why Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune?
Actually, it's really interesting. And the news, the local news. Why do most, okay, here's a pop quiz. How do most people in this country get their news? Local television news. Okay? Not the 5:30 or 6:30 national news, not cable channels, not the newspaper on their front yard, local television news. Why do they tune in? Weather and sports. Okay? Why does that make them good advertising targets? They're people who selected to expose themselves to that show without a particular political prejudice. That makes them vulnerable for persuasion because they're tuning in to hear news, but they're getting exposed to political advertising. The same thing with Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune because they also run in approximately the same time slot, plus or minus a little bit. They have fairly big audiences of relatively old people who vote, unlike young people, and as a result, they're tuning in for a purpose unrelated to politics. And that makes them a bit more vulnerable. If you were advertising on a political show in the evening, so Fox and MSNBC both have some political ads being run. But it would be really bizarre if the McCain campaign wastes much money on MSNBC or the Obama campaign wastes much money on Fox. And here's my punchline. Not because the shows or the anchors are necessarily biased, but because the audience is biased. Okay? The people that regularly watch Fox because they believe that it gives them a conservative perspective, regardless of whether it does or doesn't, are exactly the self-selected choir that it would be a waste for Obama to try to convert. It might possibly be a choir that McCain would like to get to sing a little bit louder, and so some ads there make sense. And exactly the same thing on MSNBC. So, you know, it might or might not be that their news content or their opinion content is biased, but as long as the audience shows this big bias, it's not really fertile ground for both of them to advertise. Okay, so that's the deal. And the advertising's been extreme. My colleague Ken Goldstein's Wisconsin Advertising Project tracks every presidential ad aired in the country, in any market. They coded 2.4 million ads in the 2004 cycle, and it's running about 50% above that so far in this cycle. In June and July, the two campaigns aired 100,000 ads nationally, spent $50 million, roughly equally, about $25 million or so apiece. And of that 100,000 ads, half ran in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. In the aftermath of the conventions, the two have run around 50,000 ads in just the first 3 weeks after the convention. Of those, more than half aired in the Big Ten states, the states of the Big Ten Conference. And that doesn't even count Illinois, where nothing has run, right? And so the focus of the advertising is very much in the battleground states, many of which are these Midwestern Big Ten states. The exceptions are Colorado, Nevada, what's that state up there? New Hampshire, Virginia, and I'll get to it in a minute, surprisingly, North Carolina. By the way, what time am I supposed to stop?
When you feel you have to.
No, I think that's when you feel you have to. Seriously, I don't know. Okay, fine. I also have no idea when we actually started. So between those, I'm a little confused. So let's look at the states. Don't look at that. Look at this. Those are the states where the Republican, McCain, is now to the left of 0. So this is McCain ahead. These are strong Republican states. I don't think you'll find a single one there a surprise. The one perhaps noteworthy point is that in June and mostly July, Obama spent a ton of money in Georgia and got precious little for it. He also spent $80,000 in Alaska, and here's what he got for it. Can you tell when Sarah Palin got picked? Back when he was spending that $80,000 back here, because of the scandals, Senator Stevens' trial for corruption and so on, it was a long shot, but there was at least some plausible possibility that Alaska could be made competitive. And that ended about the 29th of August. Okay? So, end of that one. Here are the strong Democratic states. And again, mostly not a surprise. Hawaii, my wife's home state. Vermont, Massachusetts. Again, all of these are familiar. The one pretty interesting one is Iowa, right here. Because Iowa is now running well ahead of the margin of error and the confidence interval here. And Iowa was one of only 2 states that switched from Gore to Bush between 2000 and 2004. And so for Iowa now to flip back pretty solidly for Obama is a gain of all of 7 electoral votes. Just to put that in perspective, in order to win, Obama and the Democrats need to pick up a net of 18 electoral votes. So picking up those 7 puts them a little less than halfway there. Okay? None of the other states here is a flip. They're all just voting Democrat like they did last time, so not very interesting. Currently leaning Republican states, there are only these 2, Missouri and West Virginia. Missouri is one of those states that in May Democrats think they can win, and by September they've cut all their advertising and pulled their staff out of the state. I predict boldly that the same thing will happen this time. The state has simply not moved very much in Obama's direction, even though he won the primary by a narrow margin there. And West Virginia is a little more surprising given how badly Obama did there in the primary. There's not a whole lot of polling in West Virginia, so neither of those look very interesting, and both went Republican in 2004, so no effect on the electoral vote there. If we look at leaning Democratic states, we've got 5. These top 3 look to be relatively solidly, even though they're a little outside the margin of error, relatively solid Democratic. But New Mexico would reflect the other state that went from Gore to Bush with its 5 electoral votes, and now looks not nearly as certain as Iowa, but at least poised to flip back Democratic. So put those two together, you're looking at a net gain of 12 out of the 18 electoral votes that the Democrat needs. Michigan and Wisconsin are both highly competitive states in previous elections. They're pretty competitive now, though both are not as competitive as you'll see in a few others. Here's Michigan and all of the polling in Michigan. And what you see is that it's tight, quite tight, but there have only been 2 polls recently that showed McCain ahead. So this is the question of whether you believe in the narrow but consistent lead really ought to translate into more certainty that the Democrats win Michigan, or whether there's really some chance that it switches Republican. I'd say the flatness of the trend over the summer suggests that it's really not going either way, and so advantage Obama there. Wisconsin, on the other hand, was decided by 5,000 votes out of 3 million votes in 2000, and by a whopping 11,000 votes out of a little more than 3 million in 2004. So my state has been extremely competitive. And yet, back here, these polls were showing Obama leading by 9 to 13 points in June. That shrank to about 5 or 6 or 7 points in August, had shrunk down to 1, 2, or 3 points for 4 polls right after the Republican convention, and the most recent 3 polls have moved back up to a little bit over 5 points. There's just not enough data here for my blue line to dip down and come back up, so it's splitting the difference right now. And that's a general problem with looking at these state polls. But here's where the election is likely to be decided. Michigan and Wisconsin both end up going Democratic. Again, no net change in the electoral college vote. Minnesota, which is normally pretty reliably Democratic, only about a 3-point lead and well inside the margin of error. Minnesota, like Wisconsin, had a big high teens Obama lead in June and July that's now all but vanished. Pennsylvania, very competitive. Colorado represents another potential move from a Republican to a Democratic column. If that happened, that would be excellent news for Obama, picking up another 7 electoral votes. But New Hampshire is dead tied. The estimate here is 0.04% is the difference between the two. It's as close to 0 as anything. It's 4 electoral votes, and you have to take those away from the Democrat. Those were 4 that Kerry got that now are very much uncertain. North Carolina, shockingly competitive now. No reason that should be. I'll show you a little bit about that. Virginia, the one that everybody thought would be the very competitive East Coast state, South Atlantic state, about as competitive as North Carolina, but still both of them a little bit of a McCain advantage. Nevada went Republican last time and is a little, there's been high hopes that there's been very high new registrants for Democrats in the state and so on, but so far the polling is still giving McCain the advantage. And Florida, what can you say about Florida? Ohio, the big swing state. And you guys, Indiana, shockingly, again, not a state that has been that competitive in the past. But if we look at these, if North Carolina, Virginia, Nevada, Florida, Ohio, and Indiana all stay Republican, And if New Hampshire, teetering there on the brink, falls to McCain, then the electoral vote you see here is 269 to 269, and the House of Representatives gets to make the call. Okay? If New Hampshire falls to this side, then Obama wins. If North Carolina or Virginia or Nevada were to come over to this side and everything above it, Obama wins. And so the issue here is it's about as tight right this second as it could possibly be on the electoral vote side, with McCain having a small advantage but contesting 1, 2, 3, I don't really think in Florida, maybe Ohio, maybe Indiana, but I don't believe that. Do you believe that? You don't believe that, right?
I'll tell you why maybe if you want to know.
That's right. Yeah, well, again, I'm going to postpone, especially since I'm out of time. But the bottom line is there are a few more Republican states that are now in this toss-up category where McCain's leading, but only by a little bit, than there are symmetrically for the Democrats. So there's a little bit of an advantage there to Obama. But I think that 269 possibility is certainly riveting and attention-getting. I'm not going to talk through these, but you can see. So Minnesota coming down over the course of the summer. Pennsylvania coming down, but still Obama ahead in most of the polling. Excuse me. Colorado, a little bit more of a legitimate toss-up in that there's been quite a bit of polling showing a slight McCain advantage, but of course the net has been for Obama. Look at New Hampshire. My goodness. North Carolina, this is the state that I would never have believed 3 months ago could possibly be this competitive. And yet it's not a fluke of 1 or 2 polls. The trend has been remarkably steady for like 4 months. And it's now really that close. Also, Elizabeth Dole, Senator Dole, is up for re-election this year, and she's trailing her Democratic challenger. And so that suggests both maybe some movement within the state and disaffection with her, disaffection with President Bush. We've seen a general pattern of declining Republican identification in the country by about 6 or 7 points over the last 4 years. All of those things would make many states come into play. But North Carolina, I mean, having John Edwards from there on the ticket 4 years ago didn't do it. But maybe this time it's quite a shocker. Virginia, all those high Democratic hopes are hardly gone at this point, but you can see that the blue line is not in the direction the Obama campaign was hoping, and this cluster of points must warm the cockles of Senator McCain's heart. Nevada, very competitive, some above, some below. Florida, pretty steadily McCain, but a few Obama leads by a small margin. Here's Ohio. This is the one the Democrats most wanted to pick up, but the trend has been pretty solidly against them in the last couple of months. Here you guys are. This is probably one of those close but no cigar cases, but you can see this is Ann Seltzer's poll from a couple of weeks ago. And Ann's the woman that got Iowa right when everybody said she was crazy, so I don't argue with Ann Seltzer. And you shouldn't either. The race is this close, and it's going to stay this close. I'd like to remind you that races are dynamic. And over the previous 2 campaigns, we've seen even more dynamics than we've seen this year. And we could see more dynamics yet, whether that's up further for Obama or whether it's a reversal in moving in McCain's direction, time will tell. So I'm going to stop now so anybody that really has something better to do, which ought to be all of you, can leave. But if you have questions, and we're going to talk about likely voter, but I'm now done, so if anybody does have to leave, feel free to get up and go.